Good morning. Welcome to the Boardwalk Talks program brought to you by the Alabama Aquarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the lab, and this morning we are going to be chatting with Dottie Byron, who is project manager for the Restore Act's Submerged Aquatic Vegetation Restoration Monitoring, Mapping, Monitoring and Restoration Project. And Dottie is also working on her PhD. She's been at the lab for a little while as a researcher here, and so she is deep into submerged aquatic vegetation and has been for a long time. So with that, I'm going to let Dottie tell you a little bit about it.
Yeah, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining live, and I want to thank the live audience we have today. It's really nice to have you all here on this dreary Alabama day. So what I am going to share with you today is something that I'm really passionate about, and that's submerged aquatic vegetation. And I always said I went into plants because my father was a veterinarian and I don't like animals and blood. So I went into the wonderful world of plants, and ironically I cannot grow a terrestrial plant to save my life, but I can grow underwater plants no problem, and I'm pretty good at it. So, well, I think I'm good at it. It's a little boisterous of me, but anyway, so I wanted to talk to you today about a large group of aquatic angiosperms called subaquatic vegetation. So this is actually a very large term that encompasses both groups. So this is our freshwater plants and our marine plants. Marine plants, you will also know, will be called seagrasses because they look like grasses and they grow in the sea. The primary difference between these two is their salinity tolerances. So seagrasses really don't like fresh water. Some of them can tolerate fresh water, but they really need higher salinity waters. And our freshwater macrophytes, our submerged aquatic vegetation, really don't like salt. So that's sort of the dividing line between the two.
So can you explain what angiosperms are?
Oh, angiosperms are flowering plants. So
they are true plants.
So they are true plants.
Differentiated from algae.
Yes, very true. Thank you for that. The multicellular flowering plants. So the two groups, so your freshwater macrophytes and your seagrasses, have a lot of similarities, which is why they kind of get lumped in together. Some interesting facts, hold on, because I remember this. So both of them evolutionarily evolved to live underwater about 100 million years ago, so during the Cretaceous period. So if you think about that time, the seas were populated by what are now extinct marine reptiles, rays, modern sharks, horseshoe crabs, and the land was populated by dinosaurs. So these plants have had a long evolutionary history in our geologic time. There are, I cannot tell you how many freshwater species there are because I didn't look that up before this talk, but I do know that there are about 50 species of seagrasses worldwide. And in our waters in coastal Alabama and along the northern Gulf Coast, we have 6 of these species. So, and in North America, there are about 8 species. I think that's correct, yeah. So we have a lot of diversity with our marine plants and our freshwater plants in this area. I guess I can show you the different types of grasses we have. So I'll show you guys later, but the primary grass that you'll find, there's 2 species that look very similar. The first is called shoal grass or Halidulirhydii. It's a very thin blade grass, looks kind of sparse, but it can grow in densities of 100 shoots per meter squared. It's also looks like, and is also confused by what we call widgeon grass or Rupia marittima. Now Rupia is a fun kind of grass because it is one of our seagrasses that can tolerate really low salinity waters. So you'll actually find that up in the Mobile Tensas Delta. And it's also an interesting one because it reproduces more similar to a freshwater plant where it puts its reproductive shoots up in the water column, where all of these other seagrasses that I'm going to talk about have their flowering structures at the base of their shoot. Then we have our turtle grass, so aptly named because of the animals that like to munch on them. Sorry about that. And that's Thalassia testudinum. This is a broad-leafed grass, and it's found more to our east. And there's some places on Horn Island and in the Chandeleur Islands that you will find this grass. There's a large area of turtle grass over in St. Joe Bay, and that's where there's a lot of juvenile green turtles. So it's kind of a fun thing that we like to look at in terms of habitat dynamics. The last grass is manatee grass, or Syringodium filiforme. This is a fun little grass because its blade is cylindrical, so it's not a flat-bladed plant, it's a round plant, and it also, no, its flowers are down. But it's, and we have some of that over off of the Gulf Islands National Seashore to our west off of Petty Boy and Horn Island. But we don't really have much of it in Alabama's waters. It picks back up in Big Lagoon. So the spatial dynamics of where these grasses grow are interesting too, and a lot of that is dominated by wave energy, salinity, and benthic habitat type. So I've talked a little bit about the structure of seagrasses. If you think about your lawn, it's always the easiest way to think about it. You know, your grass in your lawn grows along a rhizome and puts up shoots. Same thing here. They grow along a benthic rhizome, and then they put up a shoot, and then they'll have leaves off that shoot. And off of that rhizome, there'll also be roots that'll be used for nutrient uptake and stabilization. Their rhizomes are buried deep in the sediment, which is one of the benefits and why we like seagrasses in areas, because that root structure and rhizome structure stabilizes the sediment, so it keeps it from moving around and can help clear up the water quality. Their leaves, as they flow, dampen wave energy, so they are also known as shoreline protection devices with you know, big waves come in, that kind of slows down the water. And that is also why they are known as the nurseries of the sea, because lots of juvenile and planktonic larvae get to these areas where the water slows down, and then they settle down, and then they grow up there. The other thing is those leaves will provide structure. So, you know, where do you want to live? Do you want to live in the savanna where, you know, the desert where there's nothing and the big red drum can see you, or do you want to live where there's structure and you can hide? And it's actually quite fun to snorkel in the grass, because when you come up, all the fish start down, and then as you kind of settle in, they'll start coming back up and feeding again. So it's a really diverse and fun place to be and explore.
And then you also have algae that grows on the grasses, so that adds some complexity and some food and some dynamic relationships between the plants and the tree plants and the algae. Yeah, so seagrasses and submerged aquatic vegetation are part of a group of habitats that are known as foundational habitats. So that's like if you build it, they will come sort of thing. It is a house for multiple other species and other plants or epiphytes for the algae. The other foundational habitats are salt marshes, or your coastal marshes, and your oyster reefs. So when you have these habitats, it's a really good sort of healthy environment for lots of things to grow up in, and supports a lot of our coastal ecosystem services. Another thing that's like your lawn plants is that seagrasses and freshwater macrophytes, most of them grow from the bottom up. So from the bottom of the leaves to the top. So if we'll just look at this example of this is a freshwater plant. This is Vallisneria americana, or also known as tape grass or wild celery, just depends on who you talk to. They'll actually start their leaf growth on the bottom. So the stuff at the top is really old leaves, and that usually gets covered with epiphytes. And the way that they grow is also from the inside out. So the inner leaf is the youngest leaf. And over time, as those leaves grow out, they slough off those older leaves. So if you've ever been along the beach and you see a lot of beach rack, that's these blades of grass. It's probably seagrass, old leaves. And that, what we call detritus, those old leaves that sort of
fall off and then land in the benthos, has its own processes that occur and feeds a lot of other organisms as well. So there's a whole microbial and detritivore loop that our submerged aquatic vegetation feeds. So because of the way they grow, you can, with the seagrasses, you can also age how old a shoot may be based on those leaf scars from how they're growing out, which is quite interesting. Let's see what else I got. I got that one. So another reason that we as humans should appreciate and love our seagrasses, not just because they're awesome, but because humans actually have used them for a variety of things for many years. They've been used as fertilizer for sandy soils. They've been used as filling for mattresses. They've been made into,
I did know that one.
Yeah, they've been made into furniture like rattan chairs and doormats. And that's, you can actually Google seagrass mats and you'll get it's another species from the Indo-Pacific called Posidonia. It makes a really thick, good leaf, and that can be used for chairs and doormats. And they've also been made into clothing accessories like hats, which as soon as I find a seagrass hat, I'm going to wear it all the time. Really.
So you mentioned that they are nursery habitat, but if we're thinking in terms of benefits that they provide to humans, some of the animals that begin life in seagrasses are fishery species that grow up, and then we like to harvest them and eat them. So they're, they provide a benefit to a lot of different animals as a nursery habitat, but we're, additionally interested in their role as support for our fishery species.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. So these habitats, it provides great structure to hide from big fish, and it's a great place to grow up. So our recreationally and commercially important fishery species like red drum, speckled trout, blue crabs, what else? I'll remember them later. They all have a juvenile time in the seagrass beds, and then they get big and move off. There's also a lot of other fishes that those commercially important fish eat. So like pinfish, spot, croaker, white trout, silver perch. I always get those mixed up. I'm not a fish person, obviously. Show me an algae or a seagrass or a freshwater plant, I know it, but my fish, I make up names. So they're a great habitat, not only for growing up, but also as a food source for those bigger fish. And they're also used by our charismatic megafauna. So your manatees are vegetarians, and they eat seagrass. They also eat freshwater plants. So if we have a healthy SAV community, we have habitat for these large megafauna to come in.
And sea turtles.
And sea turtles, yep, absolutely. So there's a turtle called the green turtle, and that predominantly eats turtle grass, as it's aptly named. And the thing is, and this is sort of why we care so much about the health and the resilience of our seagrass communities, is when you start to lose these communities, you will start to see a decline in all of these fishery species. If there's no place for the juvenile red drum to grow up, well, then your juvenile drum get eaten and then they don't make it to adulthood. Same thing with your speckled trout. So that's why they're really important habitats. Some of the other, what we call ecosystem services, so these are services that are beneficial to humans that our ecosystems provide us, is, these are plants. Plants like fertilizer to grow. So they are great at taking up nutrients in the water. So they can clear up the water column by taking up nutrients. They can also, like I said before, stabilize the benthic sediment so that you don't get a lot of particles in the water. I'm trying to think what else. They stabilize shorelines, and then the nursery habitat role. One point I would like to add about the nutrient uptake is there is a tipping point at which there's too much of a good thing. And when we, have large runoff events where there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water from terrestrial runoff, that can actually cause a seagrass decline because our algae and our phytoplankton in the water column can uptake those nutrients a lot faster than these grasses can. And then what they do is they end up shading out the plant. Same thing with the algae. So the epiphytes that grow on the plants can uptake these nutrients a lot quicker, so they'll actually overgrow and shade these plants out, and then you'll lose.
So these, Dottie had already pointed these plants out, but just to point out, there is algae growing on those grasses. So that's what she's talking about, the epiphyte algae growing on the grasses. If it gets too thick with, too much nutrient input, then it can shade the grasses out.
And it's interesting because these systems have also evolved so that they have partnerships with other organisms. So there's a lot of gastropods, and there's actually one in there now, that's an olive snail, an Aratina, that go and eat the algae off of them. But as we fish down our food webs, we are now removing the predators of the fish that eat these guys. So then those fish blow up, and then they eat all our grazers. So there's a lot of things to study with habitat dynamics and food web dynamics and restoration goals with these plants.
Well, I'll just also point out that we presume a lot of nutrient inflow from runoff, and it comes from fertilizer that's been applied to crops, or even lawns. Other things can serve as fertilizer. But when you say that provides an ecosystem service of removing nutrients, we're tending to presume an excess of nutrients in the water, often from runoff from human applied fertilizers of different kinds. And also these are kind of near shore ecosystems, so they do tend to be in areas that would also be areas that are getting the nutrient inflow.
And that's a good point. So these grasses require really good water quality. They need about 30% of the light coming in from the surface of the water in order to photosynthesize. Now, if you think about plankton, that only needs like 1%, which is why plankton can grow so deep. These guys are limited on how deep they can grow based on how much light reaches the bottom. So in our areas, you are not going to get grass below 2 meters because it just gets too dark down there and they can't photosynthesize, so they can't fix carbon and grow.
We have a lot of sediment flowing into our water because we're part of a major estuary system with a lot of rivers that flow into Mobile Bay.
Right. You've got the Mobile Tensai Delta, which pushes out a lot of water. You got the Mississippi River Delta. You have the Perdido River, sort of all the way across. So once you start getting over to, and then the Big Bend area, there are little pockets of clear water that maybe doesn't have a lot of fresh water inflow from rivers. The Big Bend area is another area where there's a lot of freshwater inflow from the rivers. So you don't get deep seagrasses until you get sort of down into west coast of Florida, offshore the shelf, and then around Keys and down in the Tortugas. But in the Florida Keys, you could be in 30 feet of water, and there's thalassia growing, and it's beautifully lush and rich and really nice habitat. That's where I hail from, South Florida, and I did my master's degree at Florida International University, so I did a lot of research in the Florida Keys. But predominantly, our species here like shallow and relatively calm waters. So I've kind of jumped around between seagrasses and freshwater SAV. There are some similarities to them, but sort of I kind of want to touch on how we sample these things. So how do we monitor a seagrass bed? Like, what do we do? Like, how do you know you can't see in the water? What do you do? So there's a couple of different things. We do mapping. So this is large aerial mapping using There's some groups that do it with satellites. There's groups that do it with just a small plane that has a camera fixed on the bottom, and they take a bunch of photos, and then you put it into a geographic information system and draw polygons around it. And that gives you your aerial extent of the grass, right? But you don't really know who's there and how much of it is really there. So a sparse area, so with not a lot of shoots, could look the same as a dense area, or it also can look like an area that has no grass. So that's when we go out and we monitor and we say, this is called ground truthing these images. And so we go out to fixed points within these beds, within our fly zone, and we take our favorite sampling unit, which is a 1/4 meter squared quadrat. So if you ever see a benthic ecologist with one of these, I've actually had people like, what's with that PVC square you got? This is what we call a quadrat. It is a 1/2 meter by a 1/2 meter. Usually, and this one's getting redone, there's tape along the sides marked in 5 centimeter increments. So when we take a photo, we can kind of gauge how much of the area we're seeing. And so we throw this down and we do a pretty simple percent cover survey. We see how much of this bottom is covered. So you kind of mentally divide up the quadrat into 4s and say, all right, that's 25%, that's 50%. And then we write that down. And then if you go back year over year over year, you can non-destructively see how that seagrass bed is changing. We also take measurements like who's there, what species are in this quadrat, and also how high they are, how tall is the canopy. Now, this gets interesting when you start doing freshwater SAV because it's really difficult to see the bottom up there, and there's also, and my boss will laugh at me because I freak out all the time, but there's alligators, and I don't really like getting in the water with alligators, but I have, so I've kind of come up with a new method for this, and also the diversity is really high. So we have a 1 meter squared floating quadrat that's gridded out into 10 squares, so it's a 10 by 10. And what we do is similar kind of thing. It's a visual survey, and we just count how many squares we see those plants in. And we can get at the same data that's reproducible over time, so we can see how a bed will change. And this is important up in the delta because we have these large vallisneria beds that have changed from that sort of pristine vallisneria habitat to an aquatic invasive called milfoil, which is something we don't really like. Because the biodiversity of animals that milfoil supports is less than that of the vallisneria. Even though, ironically, the secondary production, so that's how much fish mass you get, is the same. Which I think, that was research that was done by Dr. John Valentine and his PhD student, now Dr. Charlie Martin. So that's sort of how we monitor these things. We also take measurements of the water. So we take a measurement of how much light is at that point in the water column. So if we go back, and these are just point measurements, but you can extrapolate over years based on how much water flow you have in there and how much lights come in, and you can run what are called optical models after you get a bunch of measurements of the water quality, and then you can start figuring out, is the water quality good or bad, and how deep the grass should be able to go. So all of this now gives us information that tells us where we need to restore these grasses.
Well, can you give us some ideas about what threats seagrasses face or seagrass ecosystems face? So what kinds of things would affect seagrass extent or seagrass, how they're thriving?
Yeah, so one of the biggest threats is water quality. That is probably the biggest threat to our submerged aquatic vegetation communities. And there are a lot of things that, especially in the Mobile Tensai Delta and with the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, where they're actually doing these watershed management plans, and they're looking at how water is entering our bay. And they're looking at upland practices like how we're building and stream restorations to try to increase that water quality, because they know the importance of good water quality gives us seagrass and submerged aquatic vegetation.
So when we're talking about good water quality versus bad water quality for seagrasses, what does this mean? Because it can mean something slightly different depending on
It
what is
really,
responding to the water quality.
water quality is really dependent on the light attenuation. So how much light is reaching the bottom? That's the primary issue for water quality. So all of the things, and this is not a technical talk to get into all of the little pieces that make up water quality, but it's based on, just broadly, it's based on phytoplankton in the water, what is known as colored dissolved organic material. So this is like the tannins that leach out of detritus from our stream beds.
Someone's like a tea.
So yeah, you'll notice when you go out on the shoreline, the water could be stained red or really dark brown. Total suspended solids in the water. So that could be from poor land use practices upland that's just, stream bed just eroding, and just dumping all its sediment down into the receiving bay. And if you look at Google Earth images of Dolive Bay, I hope I said that right, back in time, you can actually see, before they did the stream restoration, like a big, you can see it on the satellite image of a huge plume of sediment, and that's just coming from streams that were eroding, and every time it rains, you get a big push of. So
let's say too that a lot of these things that are in the water, either dissolved in the water, suspended in the water, are natural, but they may be kind of pushed out of balance. The amount that we have in the water may be pushed in one direction or another by human activities.
Yeah, right. And then those are like really large problems, right? But then there's like small problems. So this is mechanical damage, and this is folks, running their boat in a shallow water area because they're just not familiar with the water, and they run their boat through a seagrass bed, and they create what is known as a propeller scar. So in our waters, especially over in Perdido Bay, there are actually areas that are marked, and they're marked by signs like this as no motor zone seagrass beds. So if you see those, don't go past them, because that's where, one, you don't want to run your boat aground anyway, and two, that's where these valuable habitats are. And what happens is it's sort of this idea of death by 1,000 cuts, right? If you keep running your boats through these areas, you make a bunch of scars, and eventually the habitat is degraded so much that the bed disappears. The other thing, mechanical damage from anchoring. So you really don't want to anchor in a seagrass bed. You really want to, if you're in a seagrass bed, you really want to find a sand patch. That's where you want to anchor your boat. Or if you can be on the edge of the seagrass bed and anchor in the sand, that's where you want to be. Mechanical damage from docks, which is, and I believe that the Corps, to get a permit to put a dock in, actually requires a submerged aquatic vegetation survey, so that you're not damaging this habitat.
Dottie, we have a question. Jane would like to know if any predators patrol them to feed on the babies in the nursery.
Absolutely, yeah. There's all kinds of predators. It's different based on where you are, but your speckled trout will kind of zoom along. Even the red drum, you'll get the red drum feeding in both places. Like I said, I'm not a super big fish person, so I don't know, but yeah, you can just, I don't know all of the fish, I guess, but yeah, these areas are cruised by those larger fish because they're looking for a meal. But it really, the middle fish, like the pinfish and croakers and spot, they all kind of get big, and then they'll feed on the little ones and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I think the next thing I was going to talk about is how we're restoring these grasses. So I talked about, prep scars. What we're trying to do is sort of heal those scars. And what we do is a technique was started by Mark Fonseca and Judd Kenworthy from NOAA, where they were like, well, what if we put some stakes out in the water and let birds roost on them and let them sit and kind of do their thing and go to the bathroom and add a little bit of nutrients, just like you'd fertilize your lawn. The bird guano falls right down there, and it kind of gives the grass a little bit of nutrients. Not too much, but just a little bit. And so we go out, and we've done this a lot in Perdido Bay, where we restore shoalgrass beds that are over there with bird stakes. This image is kind of hard to see, but it's just a simple PVC pole with a roost on top. Really low maintenance, and in some places we plant with it, in some places we don't, because we found that just putting up these stakes actually keeps boaters away, so it lets the grass naturally heal itself over time. But if the damage was bad enough and you wanted to kind of kickstart that growth, you can take one of the faster growing species, which is Haliduli wrightii, and plant it in those scars. So here you can see some planting units that were placed in a scar, and after 1 month of planting, you can see the unit is still there, it's still thriving, it's good. And then after 2 months of planting, you can see the scar, the area that's planted, it's thicker, it's growing in. And then we wait, and a full year after planting, you can't see where that scar is. The whole thing is grown in. That planting unit is actually right there, but you can't see it, and it'll grow in. And what that does is it stabilizes that sediment in the scar, so that the turtle grass, which is a longer growing species, it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time for those to grow into big meadows, it allows that sediment stabilization so it can grow back in. So I will say this, it talks about shoalgrass and widgeon grass. Those are really fast growing species. They're called opportunistic species, kind of weedy species, but they're not really weeds. I should have said that, but because that's predominantly what we have here. But so they can grow a lot faster, which is why we use those for restoration activities.
Do you have kind of a succession where you have some of the faster growing species kind of establish a meadow first, and then over time it's like transitions into the turtle grass, or do they grow in the same kind of together?
They do grow together, but yeah, so like I said, the widgeon grass or the shoalgrass will it's over longer periods of time to get big meadows. I think the average rate of regrowth into an area that was damaged of Thalassia is like 9 years. So if you don't do anything. So this kind of helps kickstart that, stabilize the sediment, and then the Thalassia, or the turtle grass, as it grows in, is actually the end-stage sectional species. So that's like the pristine species. Not in our areas, because we don't really have Thalassia, but if you were in like South Florida. And so that will eventually outcompete the Haliduli. But in our waters, because of the light issues, the nutrients, the different dynamics, we predominantly have shoalgrass. And there's a whole bunch of people that do landscape dynamic studies and why things grow where.
And you all have been doing the bird stakes for a long time now. How long have you been doing that? And
I think I put my first bird stake in the water in 2005. So we've done a bunch of it over in Perdido Bay and also in Big Lagoon in the national park.
So you've had time to kind of assess the effectiveness of that approach?
Yeah. And like I said, it does kickstart growth, and part of it is if you plant, it goes a little bit faster. If you don't plant, it still kind of helps because it's that physical barrier, so boaters are like, oh, I can't go there. If it's an area that maybe isn't protected by, a no motor zone.
So what does planting entail? What's that process like?
So you go to a donor bed, and this is some of the active research that we're doing now is figuring out what are the best restoration practices. So you want to go find a bed that is really healthy, and you selectively take sod, essentially. You go and pull up some roots and rhizomes, and you get a rhizome with a growing tip on one end, on the rhizome end, and about 5 shoots, and you kind of put those all together, like 3 or, how many do you need? I think you need 5 of them, 3 or 5 of them. That, again, these numbers, they can change, and it's always like, what's the least amount we can get by with, I think when restoration really first started, it was like, let's put a lot of them in because then we know it's going to survive. But, you know, as these habitats are degraded, we kind of want to look at, well, how many do you really need that we can get by with so that we're not damaging more areas? But you take you dig up some of the material and you do it spaced out in the bed so your donor bed isn't damaged. And then you put them together and put them in with some landscaping stakes. And then we just monitor it for survival and growth.
How deep do you put it in?
Yeah, I mean, we're only going to plant where grass would grow. And so all our grasses in Alabama are under 2 meters of water. So usually we're in about, 2 meters is 6 feet. So usually we're about 3 feet of water.
Or how deep subsurface? Like, do you put the...
Oh yeah, so it's actually, I wish I had like a bucket of sand I could show you. You don't need to bury them super deep. It's really like a kind of a weird technique where I just kind of put my fingers in, or you can use a hand trowel and just kind of put them in and you pull it to the side and you put the stake in and you push it down and then you let the sediment kind of fall back over on it. So.
And then you are growing some, but...
So this is a different project. So, you know, there's been a lot of work on seagrass restoration. And now we're starting to look at, there's also a lot of work on freshwater SAV restoration, predominantly Vallisneria. And a lot of this is done in lakes and streams in Florida. So we're starting to do this in, the Mobile Tensile Delta. So what we are doing is late summer, these plants start flowering, and if you ever go out in the Delta, you'll see a lot of what looks like snow on the water, and that's the pollen. And if you can come in with the camera, I can show you. So really these things, they put up a long shoot up at the surface of the water, and it's a little flower. It's maybe the pea pod will get like that, and these petals collect the pollen, and then it germinates the flower, and you get this fruiting structure, which is a seed pod. And this long structure this is attached to the bottom. This is called a peduncle. And it's kind of cool because they kind of curl up to the surface. And then you get these large seed pods. And when we go restore them, we go to an area has been fruiting, and we just randomly select seed pods, and then we throw them in the refrigerator until we're ready to start planting them and letting them germinate. And what's really interesting about these is we don't have to collect a ton of them because one seed pod can have hundreds of seeds. So here you can see this image. Here's the seed pod. This is like just some of them that are germinating. This is what the seed looks like as it's germinating. And what's interesting about the Vallisneria is that they start germinating in the seed. So in the seed pod, they'll start germinating. And there's if you cut this open now, there's like a bunch of jelly in there. So as the outside disintegrates, they start germinating. And that's something I want to, is like a side project with my dissertation, is looking at, because we found that if we throw a seed pod in here and it disintegrates and it makes these little seedlings, not everything will germinate, but then we'll take seedlings out and then others will germinate. So that's a seed pod with hundreds of little seeds in them. So as we take these seedlings out, then more seeds will germinate, and it keeps going. So it's quite interesting because
some sort of stimulus.
Yeah.
So seeds are responding to.
Yeah. So I'm kind of interested to see why that is and how that is. The other thing I want to look at is an area where I want to take these seedlings and plant them with and without milfoil. To see if there's some kind of competitive interaction where the seeds don't germinate if milfoil is there, which would then allow the milfoil to proliferate, which is really what we don't want. So
for those who aren't familiar with milfoil, it can float and shade the seagrasses or the submerged aquatic vegetation that would be growing in the bottom.
Yeah, they have they have long stalks, and they kind of come out. I'm stuck. I have a book. There's a picture of milfoil in a book over there.
The snail has started climbing up there.
Oh yeah, he's happy in there eating. And these plants are great. This is why I can grow them, because you don't need that much. This thing has just been in here for probably over a year. It's just growing.
Yeah.
There's no aeration. I threw a snail in there, he eats some of the algae, and they're just happy as can be. So what we do is we take these seed pods, and then when we're ready, we put them in these containers and let them germinate. And as they get bigger, we plant them into like peat pots, and then we put them into outside big tanks and let them get bigger. And then we use those for restoration activities in the Delta. And another active sort of project we have going on is we're looking at what are other things you can do when you're restoring to get a better success rate. So there's ideas of, like I said, the planting unit, like how you plant, whether or not you plant in rows or you plant a clump together. Or there's also the idea of, these ecosystems have a lot of things in the sediment. There's microbes in the sediment. So what if you inoculate the sediment? Does that increase your success rate? A lot of seagrass restoration projects, unfortunately, unless they're large enough, do not have a high success rate. I think it's like 30%, like worldwide. So that's not really good. So anything we can do to increase that success rate, we really want to do, and which is why it's an active area of research. The other thing is, what if you put like a biological partner, like a clam in there, right? So clams are known to live in seagrass beds, and I could go on about the process of clams increasing the success and growth of seagrass and submerged aquatic vegetation. So what happens if we plant some clams in there too? If we add some clams in there too, does that increase the success rate? As it also helps stabilize the sediment as those clams feed, and then they put some nutrients into the sediment from their waste. Does that help? So those are some things that we're actively working on, and we'll be doing a lot this summer.
Can you give us an idea of the area of extent of the restoration,
So right now, restoration experiments are pretty small. Maybe the size of this room. It depends on, and we're with the SAV Restore grants. We need to restore 300 linear meters, which is 1,000 feet of prop scars. And we are at 272, and we've got 2 years left of the project, so that's good. I was going to look at that before I started this, because I was going to give the aerial extent of how much seagrass we have in our waters, and I completely forgot to do that this morning. I apologize. I had a meeting earlier that took my attention elsewhere, but the other thing is scaling up, right? And there are actually consulting firms in Florida that do promise better results when you scale up. But it's sort of working out those little details are usually done on a smaller scale, and then you just move to different places. And if you have a successful restoration, then you've got a 100-meter squared area that's restored, and then you can move to the next area. And the hope is that those blocks, those squares that you restore, grow out, sort of like, tentacles.
So, I know you've been talking about this the whole time, but I just want to emphasize that you all are not just going out there and planting or restoring. You're also doing a lot of research on kind of the best practices that will make the restoration project successful so that you can scale up.
Right.
So that's a major part of the project. So in some cases, when folks are doing restoration, the best practices are kind of already established, and they get to the work of doing the restoration, and it's maybe a bigger restoration project, but you guys are you're still heavy into the research on the...
Yeah, and that's the thing about best practices. They're always evolving, they're always changing. Science is always learning, right? We never just say, this is how it is. We're always examining how we can be better and more efficient and improve outcomes. That's sort of what scientists do. We look out and see what the question is, and we're like, why is that thing like that? Oh, I'm going to figure it out.
So is there kind of a broad scale message that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I love seagrass, and you should too. Well, I should say I love submerged aquatic vegetation, and you should too. If you like seafood, if you like good water quality, if you like all of the things our bay has to offer, you should hug a plant today.
And I think that a lot of people are not very familiar with submerged aquatic vegetation or seagrasses, so that's something that folks can learn more about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Well, thanks for chatting with us this morning, Dottie.
You're very welcome.
And thanks for joining us.
Thank you to the live audience. Thank you to everyone online. I appreciate it. And seriously, I talk about this stuff all day long.